Yes, thanks, and good afternoon, everyone. Look, this is a nice cartoon graphic talking to the issue of how sound is transmitted into the ear. It doesn't really show all the auditory pathways for processing, but it illustrates some of the pathophysiological issues that can occur with excessive noise. So our perception of loudness is directly related to the mechanical pressure of the sound wave that's transmitted through the outer ear and focused onto the eardrum. So the pressure change, because sound is a pressure wave, is captured by the eardrum, and the eardrum vibrates in tune with the displacement. And then the vibration is conveyed by the bones in the middle ear to what's called the round window of the cochlea of the inner ear. And then from there, there's a really nice little collection of fluid that's within the cochlea, which is displaced in a very specific way, depending on the intensity and frequency of the pressure wave. And so these acoustically generated pressure waves are then converted into nerve impulses by little sensory cells called hair cells, which are sitting within the inner ear. And then those nerve impulses are transmitted along a nerve pathway into the brain for processing, and that's where we perceive sounds. And of course, complex association areas within the brain linking sound with memory, with olfactory experience, with all kinds of other cognitive processes. So the perception of sound is crucially important for us, and it's a crucial aspect of our ability to communicate. And that's one of the significant issues with noise-induced hearing loss. It's a significant health problem, and it's a major economic problem in Australia as well. And how does it happen? Well, noise-induced hearing loss is specifically a hearing loss that occurs as a result of excessive exposure to noise. And what happens is that when you get excessive noise exposure, initially the metabolic processes within these hair cells are disrupted temporarily, so they don't work as well, and that's why we get this temporary reduction in hearing. And you'll hear the term temporary threshold shift, and that's exactly what it refers to. So if you've ever been to a loud event like a music concert or a sporting event, and you leave there feeling that your hearing's dulled a bit, that's actually what's happened. The inner hair cells have become metabolically exhausted. It's a temporary change, and threshold returns within a few hours. The problem is that with repeated excessive exposures, where there's insufficient recovery time, or with just much higher cumulative exposures, there's going to be permanent damage to these inner ear cells, and that's what results in the noise-induced hearing loss. And because of the damage to the inner hair cells and the nerve pathways, people often also experience tinnitus, which is the perception of unusual, abnormal sounds in the ear that's not been created by any sort of impulse. So it's things like high-pitched whistling or blowing or clicking or ringing in the ears. It can be on one ear or both ears. It's usually in both ears that people have got hearing loss in both ears. And that's why one of the questions in the audiometry screen is, do you experience tinnitus, and does it impact on communication? So the risk of developing noise-induced hearing loss is a cumulative risk. In other words, the risk increases the longer someone is exposed to excessive hearing loss, and the less opportunity there is for the inner hair cells to recover. You can have even separate brief periods of extremely high exposure through the workday, and that increases your hearing loss risk, even if your hearing for the rest of the day is well under the standard. The important thing to be aware of is that hearing loss due to excessive noise, the risk of that developing is greatest during the first 10 to 15 years of exposure. So relatively early on, potentially in someone's career, that's where the hearing loss development risk is the greatest. There's a lot of variability regarding how susceptible we are to hazardous impacts of excessive noise, so genetics, other medical conditions, perhaps medications people are taking. And the occupational exposure standards are intended to take individual variability into account. But my view over the years is that I think that the occupational exposure limits, the standards may just be a little bit too high. My sense is that they probably would be better to be a little bit lower, but obviously these are the standards we've got, the ones we've got to work with. I just also briefly want to mention, if we've got time, ototoxic agents, because you'll see them mentioned in the code of practice. And an ototoxic agent is a chemical exposure of some kind that can be toxic to the inner ear and the pathways to the brain. So it can cause hearing loss. It could cause loss of damage to the inner hair cells, cause damage to the nerves that travel from that area into the brain. Why I mention this is that some workplaces will have potential exposure to ototoxic agents like solvents or heavy metals, other various chemicals. And what we do know now is that if someone's exposed to ototoxic agents and noise simultaneously, there is a synergistic, in other words, a multiplicative effect on the risk of hearing loss. There are also other agents like antibiotics, which are also commonly ototoxic as well. We normally would only take them for a short period of time. I have seen cases in clinical practice where people do get sensorineural hearing loss following a course of antibiotics. Why is this relevant? I think it's very relevant with my view is it's very relevant with the changes that are happening with WorkCover WA. My concerns about the approach to apportionment are numerous. First of all, clearly WCWA have determined that they're going to be calculating the liability relative to the workers, the fractional period of employment. It doesn't really take into account the extent or intensity of exposure or the cumulative duration or frequency of exposure, nor does it really take into account that someone's hearing loss may have really developed most significantly during the first 10 or 15 years of exposure. The other issue is that a worker might have worked for 20 years for employer A and 10 years for employer B, but the cumulative noise exposure may have been significantly higher for employer B than for employer A. So the relative contribution from B would probably be more than the 1/3 of the apportioned liability. So for example, if the worker who worked for employer B was working 12-hour shifts with less time for recovery between shifts, there's more potential for damage. Or if the workplace they're in had more noise intensity, there's an increased cumulative risk. And what we do know, because of the complexity of converting sound pressure level to noise intensity, you only need a 3 decibel difference in noise exposure to equate to a doubling in noise intensity. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a doubling in risk of noise-induced hearing loss. So potentially significantly greater risk of damage to the inner ear, particularly if the hearing protection measures aren't sufficiently attenuating. So I think that the noise exposure records and potentially having a really robust system of periodic and exit audiometry, so audiometry periodically during the period of employment and at the end of the employment, I just wonder whether they would be taken into account by the insurer when they determine apportionment. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it would be a fairer system. I mean, at the end of the day, we don't want anyone to get noise-induced hearing loss. And if we can prevent exposure to excessive noise from the source or minimize exposure, then that's obviously the best outcome. But I just wonder if there is a process of apportionment that they might take into account some of these additional records, Damien, and just to allow a fair apportionment for employers.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and thanks, Matt. And just to refer back to the advice from WorkCover WA is that when the apportionment determinations and decisions get to WorkCover, it is that really black and white rule around length of tenure based on employment history. However, I think the critical point is when the NIHL assessment's being conducted by the ENT specialist, because the ENT specialist does have the right to request access to records, historical records, and they might be noise exposure records, they might be audiometric testing records. The ENT specialist can certainly request records held by WorkCover WA, but WorkCover WA as of the 1st of July won't hold noise exposure records. They won't hold audiometric testing records because that will now fall under the work health and safety regulations. However, the ENT specialist will be able to access those if they request through historical employers and insurers as well. So hopefully we've got that point within the process and the system for someone to make that informed judgment decision making around noise exposure, around more specific impacts of certain types of employment in the employment history. You also make a very good point, Matt, around first and foremost we should be trying to protect workers against the exposure to hazardous noise.